Hello, everyone. My name is Asif Khan, and I am the Director of Innovation and Technology at TechXel. And today with us is David. David, thank you very much for taking the time out and talking to our audience about the AR and VR landscape today.
Thanks for having me.
So, David, before we start, can you give a brief intro about yourself to the audience?
Sure. I've been in the field of communications for the last 21 years. I moved into digital marketing about maybe 15 years ago because it was a more effective tool for gathering information as well as sharing it with other people. And it was also a big leveler between large organizations and small startup organizations, so who I was trying to help at the time. Through the research that I was doing, I noticed that people's attention spans, particularly in websites and social media, were dropping all the time as their connection speeds were increasing and as the variety of alternatives was also increasing. So very much is what happened with television channels, where remote controls made it easier to change the channel and there were more channels to choose from. People started surfing and moving from thing to thing and spending less time on it. So in order to convey information in the fields of marketing and communication, I ended up moving into video because it was faster and it could convey more information more quickly. And then from there, I moved, I thought the next logical progression from reading, looking at images, looking at videos would be to be fully immersed in the content, which is what brought me to start my next company, which is a virtual and augmented reality company, which uses these technologies.
Right. So thank you very much for the quick introduction. And so today's talk, we will be more focused on AR and VR side of the things, right? So, I mean, AR and VR, as I have seen, is basically evolving as the time is passing, right? So in your experience, how you have seen this particular field evolving, or I mean, from its infancy to like some maturity over the years, how you have seen that?
Well, as with any emerging technology, it tends to move from a small number of early adopters spread around the world to more and more people and more and more accessibility. And accessibility is the key here, just like with computers. There used to be one or two code-breaking computers in the world, and then there was one in every country, and then one in every city, then one in every library, and eventually one in every home, a briefcase and pocket. The same thing is occurring with virtual and augmented reality, where it's moved from a very small number of people using very expensive headsets for very specific roles to much larger numbers of people using much easier, cheaper, lighter, and accessible pieces of hardware. And this has been accelerated dramatically in recent years, mainly because of carbon footprint restrictions and people not wanting to travel as much. Obviously, with the COVID, that dramatically escalated that evolution. But the technology itself was reducing what we call friction points to the adoption of technology. It was becoming less specialist, less difficult to use. It was becoming cheaper and more comfortable to wear, lighter and more comfortable to wear. The costs were dramatically dropping from tens of thousands of pounds for a headset that would have to be attached to another computer, which itself would be tens of thousands of pounds, to devices which are hitting the market, which are completely standalone. It costs about £200 and can do everything that these very expensive devices could do before.
Right.
So the answer really is it's moving very rapidly and it's become a lot easier to access for.
Right. So one of the prime use cases of AR and VR these days being discussed is training, right? So people are employing this particular technology for training people. Now, training can be like a soft skills oriented training or a technical training or maybe like sort of skill enhancement. So in your experience, how do you think that soft skills especially, right? Uh, how AR and VR can be used to train people on the softer side or on the softer skill side, and what those advantages would be if AR and VR is employed on soft skills training?
Well, I have an interesting take on this, I think, because my background is slightly unusual as well as working in virtual reality. I'm a qualified lecturer and teacher, and I have a strong interest in psychology and sociology. So I've been observing these aspects of learning and teaching for a long time. The advantages to this kind of technology over what we call chalk and talk, very pedagogical, teacher speaks and classroom listens. It allows for contextual training, contextually relevant training, by which I mean you can take people into the environment in which that training is applicable. So if you're teaching somebody Spanish, you're not teaching them Spanish in a classroom, you're teaching them Spanish in a Spanish market. And the way that they learn is to go and, buy things at stalls using that language and be responded to using that language. That's much more contextually relevant and much more likely to be remembered when they find themselves in that environment than something that they learn in a classroom. It's also a lot faster. Now, in terms of soft skills, that is something that, to a certain extent, soft skills are where we pick up in people's body language, we pick up in their tone of voice, we pick up on their facial expressions, and we learn to communicate with them properly. Now, that is possible using a format like we're using right now, kind of video conferencing, but you miss out on things. For instance, you can't see any of my body language from the shoulders down. It's hard to really see my expressions properly. It's hard to see the way I'm moving. I'm not standing up, which isn't a natural way of interacting in many cases. I'm not moving around. Now, in virtual reality, all of this is possible. You can see the person's full body language, and it's interesting because I've studied the difference between people using hand controls in virtual reality and not using them. When they're not using them, their hands are just still by their sides. The difference between the people who are using the hand controls, where you can see the way that their hands are moving, people immediately engage with them. You see it in a virtual reality crowd. They're drawn to those people because they really feel that they're communicating with them. But the actual statistics, but that's anecdotal. The actual statistics behind this have been carried out in a study by PricewaterhouseCoopers in February of this year, where they discovered that soft skills training is something like 4 times more effective than this kind of training when you do it in virtual reality. It's even 1.5 times more effective than physical classroom training, perhaps because of the novelty, or perhaps because of the ability to place it within context, which like for instance, now retail is a very popular one. Disney approached me with looking for soft skills training for their retail division, which is huge. And they wanted to be able to place people in warehouse environments, in retail environments, and train them that way. And that turned out to be much, much more effective than trying to train them customer interaction in a classroom, which isn't the right environment.
Right. Yeah, that's helpful. And as you have also talked about some numbers as well, like the interaction would improve as compared to like having a discussion or training on Zoom or Skype, and doing it on virtual reality is going to bring quite a lot of benefits. So, however, I mean, these benefits can be only helpful if we can measure it, right? So whoever is sort of utilizing this AR and VR technology for learning or for any other use case, the engagement measurement is the key. Like, so how we actually reach to a conclusion that we have improved it by this much percentage, right? So how do you think that measurement of customer engagement or people engagement can be performed in AR and VR space?
Well, that's another interesting question, because in a normal classroom environment, you would walk around the room and you would actually observe people's interactions. You would observe how much they're picking up on the lessons learned and whether they look confused and that kind of thing. Now, this isn't something that you can do in this kind of environment, because you've just got a sea of faces, or maybe you can't see anybody at all of your audience. In this case, you can, but the other thing that you can do without what we call observational bias, when people know that they're being observed, they behave differently, and they'll pretend that they're understanding things that they're not understanding. Now, in virtual reality, it's possible for the teacher or the tutor to physically be there so that students can see them, but it's also possible for the teacher or tutor to be there and the students can't see them. don't know they're there. These interactions can be recorded, and individual students can be effectively zoomed in on at a later time to actually gauge whether they've understood things. And there is no observational bias. They are completely unaware that they're being observed, so they behave naturally. Also, what's being done currently is a great deal of post-lesson research. So they'll do large, statistically significant control group studies where 1,000 people will be trained in one environment, classroom, 1,000 people will be trained in Zoom, and 1,000 people will be trained in virtual reality. Then they will test them afterwards, either in those environments or outside of those environments for parity, and see what the differences the results are. And this is what PricewaterhouseCoopers and I believe Deloitte are doing at the moment. Now, these are not virtual reality companies. They don't have a vested interest in proving one where they just want to know whether it works or not. And what they've discovered is it really works way beyond the expectations of anybody involved, even the people in my field. It's far more effective. So you're right. The actual management and the actual marking effectively and assessment is extremely important, but that can be done much easier than in current situations.
Sure. Yeah, that's helpful information. So we have seen in a lot of movies that VR devices are presented in a fashion that, I mean, people are just wearing glasses and they see the person standing right in front of them, right? Interacting with them and all these things. So do you think that this VR is going to replace human interaction sometime in the future?
I think I wouldn't have said so a few years ago, but I'm actually observing how quickly it can slide in that direction. I think that there will always be a requirement for human interaction, but a lot less than we previously thought. We previously thought that you had to bring your hundreds of thousands of workers into centralized buildings in order for them to work effectively together. COVID has disproved that. It's proved that actually in many cases it's far more efficient to have people working from home as long as they have the ability to interact with each other. But there are, through things like Zoom or Skype or Google Hangouts, there are limitations, as we've discovered, something called Zoom fatigue. Being in these kind of meetings constantly is actually very tiring because your brain is trying to pick up on cues that aren't there. And that's quite exhausting for it. It's a bit like watching an anime where there's not as many frames on the, happening on the screen. Eventually you get a headache because your eyes and your brain are trying to compensate. Well, it's that on a broader scale. In virtual reality, you can actually be in these environments for much longer and it feels like a very short time. You could be in there for an hour and a half and it feels like 20 minutes. So it's the exact opposite. So in terms of workplace interaction, I believe that actually, yes, it's going to very quickly replace interaction in a lot of cases, mainly because there's a cost and savings imperative for the companies. If they can save money and get the same or better productivity out of it, they will. I think that people, where they can, will always wish to socialize physically with each other. But where they cannot, like for instance, they're in other countries or they're isolating or they have mobility impairments for one reason or another, then this creates a whole new opportunity for them to interact in a way that they couldn't before. And as we move in the direction of haptics, which is the ability not only to see and hear, but to feel and touch, then this is dramatically going to reduce those barriers even further. There's even technology, olfactory haptics, where you can smell. Smell is really important to human interaction, but you will be able to actually smell what's going on around you. And there's other forms of direct brain interfacing, which maybe eventually will allow us to feel things like motion and temperature changes and so forth. So, and the short answer to your question is it's not going to happen overnight, but over time, yes, it is going to slowly replace a lot of interactions, and it may even create new interactions that we couldn't previously do.
Right. So also, David, we have seen around that a lot of like fancy startups, or I mean, with brilliant product ideas, are sort of incorporating AR and VR into their product offering, right? So I mean, that is most of the time directly related with millennials or like younger generation embracing these technologies, right, and all those stuff. Enterprise, many people they take it as like old school. So in your experience or in your vision, how do you see that these technologies like AR and VR will create some opportunities for enterprises as well?
When you say enterprise, do you mean startup enterprise or do you mean large scale enterprise?
Large scale enterprises is something that I'm referring to.
Starting, yeah. Well, just like when I started out in the world of communications technology and marketing, and the internet was the new thing, and it was the great leveler between big organizations and small organizations, and allowed small bedroom operations like an online bookseller to become Amazon. So whereas previously, the big players were the bricks and mortar players, right? I believe that it's going to allow for a lot more of that. It's going to allow smaller operators in more physical realms, like, for instance, design, manufacturing, construction, physical training, physical worlds of building and development, which didn't previously lend themselves to the internet. Those are the ones that were left out. Those were the ones which you'll notice have still got the large bricks and mortar main players, because the internet couldn't really compete with the physicality of being there and learning there. That is going to change. It's going to allow for more opportunities for a wider variety of startup enterprises to compete on a level playing field, perhaps even better than a level playing field, because they don't have the same inertia as the larger organizations. They can just move and adapt very quickly. That they will be able to compete in the same way that previously organizations were able to on the early internet.
Right. So, like in our discussion, we have discussed some use cases about e-learning, skills, training, and all these things, which is related to education. So, in the last question, I would like to know your thoughts. Which industries, in your opinion, is going to benefit the most besides e-learning and education from AR and VR? Are there like other industries where, enterprises or product designers can employ these techniques to improve the user interaction or user acquisition or otherwise?
Yes, in fact, I can give you a few examples right now. Our new organization, it's just a standard virtual reality in a box solution, creating classroom or meeting room environments for initially oil and gas energy.
Right.
Now, the reason that energy is such a good one for this is that they have highly distributed locations all over the world. So doing things like site inspections and remote visits is very expensive. And a lot of the time, oil platforms are offshore in the sea. So not only do you have to fly people to the country in question, I live in Scotland and there's a great deal of activity in the North Sea off the coast of Scotland. So people will be flown from all over the world to Scotland, and then they have to be flown in a helicopter to the oil platform,
Right.
simply to carry out a site inspection. Now that requires a lot of training, a lot of insurance, a lot of time, and they can end up getting stuck in this oil platform because of weather for weeks, sometimes months, and they're having to be paid all that time. So there's massive implications for cost. There's massive implications for time wasted, and there's massive implications for safety, because these are not safe environments. So therefore, the insurance costs or the risks to the individual are huge. So the oil and gas industries have been very fast to adopt this technology. They are our primary market, because they at the moment are not making the same levels of money that they have been. So they need to make these savings. So they are jumping on this. The risk aspect of it applies to a lot of different industries, but also that distance aspect applies to other centers of energy. For instance, renewables. Many renewable energy like wind power is again offshore or quite remote, and therefore they don't so much want to save money, but they do want to save carbon. They don't want to be wasting a lot of carbon flying people all over the world to get a wind turbine that's purpose is to reduce carbon footprint. So they, again, are massive adopters of this technology, because it allows, for instance, in an example that we created, a group of 5 people to visit an oil platform in the North Sea, and then an hour later visit one in the South Pacific, and an hour later be in Houston. So these 5 people can actually view 5 different sites all around the world in one day without leaving their office, as opposed to the weeks or months that this would have taken. Now, another example that I think is really important, and this isn't a recent example, this is actually a couple of years old. It was Bell Aerosystems, so they build helicopters. They decided to use what was at the time what we would consider to be early virtual reality technology. And they used it in the design of a prototype helicopter. Normally, this would take 6 years because you would have to design it, build a prototype, put your pilots in there, see whether they liked the design of it, then make the changes, then send it back. The iterations were very, very costly and very wide. Using virtual reality, they were able to design the helicopter in virtual reality, put the pilot in the virtual reality headsets. The pilot would say, right, I don't have enough visibility down here, I need a longer window. The designer would extend that window in real time, and the design would therefore be completed far, far more quickly and far, far more cheaply. And again, a lot of these stakeholders were in different parts of the world without having to travel to each other. They managed to get the time down for creating this prototype helicopter from 6 years to 6 months from start to finish. Now imagine the savings there. Imagine the first mover advantages for the organizations. Now that is engineering and aerospace technology, so that's another one. So really what we're seeing is energy, engineering, and things, large scale projects like civil engineering as well, like building design and that kind of thing, infrastructure design. So those are the three, I think.
Right. Yeah, that's helpful. So in the last, David, any closing thoughts that you would like to add?
I think what I would like to add is I know that we hear this at the beginning of any new technology which becomes popular. It was the same with the internet. It was the same with social media. And now I'm about to say the same thing with internet. But get on board with this as early as you possibly can. Try it out for yourself. Think about whether or not this could have implications for your industry or your company or your sector or your market. Because if you don't, you may well be left behind. If you do get on board with this early, you may be one of the early adopters who achieves the advantage of using this technology before everybody else. You may be the next Amazon, you may be the next Facebook, because it takes larger organizations a while to catch up. If you're in a larger organization and you have a problem with safety, cost savings, training, that kind of thing, particularly now with COVID, consider this technology and look at the independent studies that have been done into the effectiveness of this technology, particularly the PricewaterhouseCoopers Seeing is Believing report from February. It will make a difference to your organization, to your industry. So you want to be involved. Look at the independent third parties, not people like me. Of course, I would say it's great. Look at other people who are looking at it more objectively and make your own decision. But I think it's well worth looking at.
Sure. So once again, thank you very much, David, for your time today. It was a pleasure hosting you, and I hope that we will be talking soon on another topic for our audience. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.